When free trade isn't free, we're talking about tariffs and the future of trade as it pertains to the business of agriculture in this episode of The Business of Agriculture. Are you looking for productive efficiencies in growing higher yielding, better performing crops? New Fields Ag provides a complete portfolio of biological products focused on you, the farmer. Visit newfieldsag.com for more information to help you farm better. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. I'm talking to you about something that's obviously been in the headlines nonstop and multiple times per day, every day for the last 2 weeks. I'm recording this. Certainly it's not a live show, so there's probably things that have changed just since I recorded it and released it. Okay, let's just start with a couple of thoughts here. Because we in the business of agriculture in the United States of America, where most of my listeners are, now granted I have Canadian listeners, I do pretty well in English-speaking parts of Europe, England, Australia, etc. But it really doesn't matter where you are. But let's talk about this from an American perspective, because I'm obviously a resident of the United States of America. Free trade is very good for generally economic growth. Economics should dictate that you have your strengths, your economic viability, and that should convey to then what you are best at producing, that you can produce and make the most margin on and produce at the lowest price, then should be the supply that feeds the demand wherever it should be. Globally, globalization has been really going on since the 1950s. It's ramped up since the late 70s, 80s, about in my lifetime. I was born in 1969. Things have changed markedly, and a lot of that was in the last 25 years, late 90s, early 2000s. What was the big impetus? Well, we can talk about China. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of points in here in this episode as it pertains to agriculture and using outside references about the reality of free trade and the future of trade. Now, you know, I just did a recording with Todd Thurman that came out, and I asked the question, is the future going to be dominated by protectionism, by trade barriers, because of nationalism, which then might come about, as I pose the question, if we have declining population, which is about to start happening, if we have maximized productive capacity, which we have, we're very good at making things, and if we have a growth in nationalism, meaning I don't know that the globalism thing works for me. I don't want my country to be invaded by immigrants from third world countries, like has happened a lot in Europe. You could even argue it's happened a little bit here. These are thoughts. I'm just telling you why nationalism and protectionism are kind of the same thing. We're going to protect our own. We're going to protect our own industries. We're going to protect our own workers. And to do that, we're going to put up big, huge barriers and prevent trade from foreign countries. So we've been in a globalism absolute rush for at least the last 20 to 30 years. The rise of China and globalization really kind of go hand in hand, and China became China starting about 20 years ago, early 2000s. By 2005, they were off to the races. It was 2008. I read a National Geographic from cover to cover. The whole episode of National Geographic, and this was in 2008, was all about the growth of China. China at that point was adding as much coal burning capacity as the entire United Kingdom. Remember, that's England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. They were adding in China every 4.5 months as much electric capacity, coal-fired, by the way, as the entirety of about the 65 million people that are in the United Kingdom. So this is just the pace of growth they were on already in 2008, and here we are recording this in 2025. Fair trade has been very good for China's growth as an economy. They are now the number 2 economy in the globe, and it's been very good for creating a Chinese middle class. One could argue that this growth sometimes came at the expense of the American middle class. I'm going to get into that. So I've got a whole bunch of things here to share with you. Headlines, of course, from my go-to on business, the Wall Street Journal, about tariffs. I've got agricultural publications. I've got the trade war. Obviously, I'm recording this in April. We just saw the tumult of tariffs, reciprocal tariffs being announced. All of us lost money in our retirement accounts. Then people, pulled the panic button. Oh my God, I'm not going to be able to retire. These are the same people that always sell when there's a downturn, and then all of a sudden they end up hurting themselves really badly because they seem to not understand the long-term effect of having investment, et cetera, et cetera. Been looking at what tariffs might do for our trading partners and also our trading competitors. So I'm going to get into all that. So let's talk about, first off, that trade, fair trade, if you will, isn't necessarily fair. This is a headline from April 10th. Tariffs are not the only obstacles. So when Trump hold his thing, and by the way, it's been tumultuous, we know that. And in no way, I'm not a Trump apologist. I don't even like tariffs. I'm going to start this right now. I put a recording out there in my ag commentary from an agricultural economist, educated background, and a person that has run his own business for 31 years and has grown his own personal economy by being self-employed. Trust you me, I understand economics pretty damn well. I also can tell you that from the textbook to the reality, tariffs are generally bad. Why? Because they are an attempt to circumvent economic reality and economic forces. In a true economy, the chart, I'm holding it up here. If you're listening to this, I'm doing the illustration of a supply and demand curve where the supply and the demand curve meet is called the equilibrium point, and that should be the price. Whether it's a price for your labor or a price for this ballpoint pen or a price for a car. Those price points are determined by the supply of the said good and or service and the demand. What tariffs do is add a dollar amount or a yuan amount or a peso amount or an Italian lira or a euro, whatever currency we are talking about, onto the top of what would be the normal market price. Free trade would mean that whatever you're economic advantaged to making or producing or providing, you do for me and I buy it for you at that price, and the low price should win, which means the consumer wins. That's the problem with tariffs. Like minimum wage laws or rent ceilings, yes, you've heard about controlled rent in places like New York City, are attempts to circumvent the economic forces that set prices. Oh, we think rent is too high, we're going to put a rent ceiling on that. You're not allowed to charge more than this, but the market would demand $10,000 for this apartment. I'm only allowed to charge $5,000, whatever that number should be. The marketplace would be that if you are incompetent, uneducated, illiterate, and lazy, maybe the highest you could ever actually get paid to show up at a job or not show up most of the time might be $2 an hour. But minimum wage laws create a minimum, a floor, and says even though the true market price for what you're allowed to deliver might be $3, we have to pay you $9 because that's the minimum wage as set by federal and or state governments. Minimum wage laws, rent control are all attempts to essentially distort economics. So are tariffs. Tariffs distort true economics. As an ag economist, I oppose tariffs. However, these equilibrium points and supply and demand curves work if you're in a free market. Fair trade. We haven't really been there. I shot a video when I was hiking in the desert about this very topic. When you have countries that prop up, protect, and subsidize their own industries, we don't really have a fair trade. We don't really have a free market. Okay, what am I talking about? Steel has been used a lot in the industrial era, certainly the last 40 plus years. Japan propped up their steel industry. China invented the steel industry. Now Brazil, Mexico. The United States actually has done things to sort of prop up its steel industry. By barring imports, you say we value steel manufacturing here in our country and we're going to put big tariffs. It means you have to put a huge price on the incoming product. Incidentally, I'm not being mean. There's a lot of people that have been all over social media talking about tariffs, and I don't think they even know what the hell a tariff is. A tariff is simply a value, a dollar amount, or whatever the currency should be, as a fee put on a product. If you want to bring this pen in from China, and it would have been a 50-cent pen, and we put a tariff on it of 100%, that means it's going to be a dollar pen, because we just charge 50 cents on that. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So tariffs distort markets. Tariffs also add cost. Tariffs tend to actually harm consumers, especially lower-end consumers. But I'm going to make the case for this because when you think of these countries that have put in protections, not just tariffs, because there's non-tariff trade restrictions. The United States of America cannot sell beef into Argentina or Australia for that matter. The United States essentially can't sell dairy into Canada. 285% trade tariff, plus there's restrictions on how much can come in there. Not being mean, I love the Canadians. I've worked up there, worked for the dairy people up there. These are trade restrictions that aren't even necessarily tariffs, and sometimes they're just outright bans. You can't sell your stuff here. Okay, that being said, the trade that we see in the world is oftentimes not fair, because in Europe's case, the European Union oftentimes has used environmental standards. And I'm using quotes. If you're listening to this, I encourage you to watch this show on YouTube. Go to YouTube, type in Damian Mason, hit subscribe. I've been trying to build my subscriber base there. I didn't concentrate on it for years, and I'd like to get more out there. The more people that I have, the more people see my stuff. I'm using quotes because it was not truly environmental standards. It was the European Union and European countries protecting their own native industries and doing so under the guise of your stuff coming in is not environmentally produced or is not good for the environment. And so therefore, they actually protect their native industries. They have done so, and usually they use the two terms. Usually the two terms are safety and environmentalism, which are usually bullshit. It's just protectionism, and there's no question about it. This article right here, of course, talks about tariffs aren't the only obstacles, meaning on top of tariff charges for you to bring your product into and import it into our country, we're also going to put up other restrictions. For instance, this article goes on to say about clear protectionism in some cases. Argentina for years forced car companies that wanted to import cars to either build factories in Argentina or export products that were equivalent in value to their imports, meaning some countries have what they call a swap. You have to, if you're going to bring in $10 billion of stuff, you have to figure out a way to take $10 billion of their products back out. Interesting, isn't it? Yes, that's a reality. I know a woman that worked in the military contractor business, meaning they built things like bombs, airplanes, surveillance, whatever. And for countries that needed American-made military gadgetry, they had to do a swap. If the country was going to buy $20 billion of our military products, she had to figure out a way to get $20 billion of that country's goods exported out of that country, probably to the United States. See, this has been going on for a long time. So is this really fair trade? Well, you didn't know this, but the United States runs a $1.2 trillion trade deficit. Did you know that? In 2024, I'm holding up the graph right now. In 2024, this is out of the most recent. This is like really recent. Sorry about my cartridge, but I like this for illustrative purposes. In 2024, we were at $1.2 trillion food trade deficit. And to put that in perspective, $1.2 trillion is roughly the entire economy of the Netherlands. You might call it Holland. 17 million people live in Western European Holland, one of the world's more wealthy countries, about the number 17 or 20 wealthiest country on the planet. And we buy more crap from the world than they buy from us by the difference of Holland's entire economy. You understand why this is a big deal? Maybe it's not, because here's the thing that a lot of people get wound up about. $1.2 trillion of trade deficit, meaning we buy that much more from them than they buy from us, is generally looked upon as, oh my God, that's bad. But it's not necessarily bad. It means that you go to Walmart and you get cheap hula hoops, you get cheap electronic goods, whatever, because those come from countries. Sneakers, for God's sakes. Now, they're not necessarily cheap. If you buy a pair of number 13 size Asics Tigers like I get, they're not called Tigers anymore. It might be a $90 pair of sneakers. But the labor associated with making those sneakers was probably about 30 cents. And it was in a developing or third world country. And so what we have here is probably an American worker that's not going to necessarily take up sewing sneakers together. The trade deficit isn't bad in and of itself, meaning that if you're a wealthy country like the United States of America, you're going to generally run trade deficits. That's the way these things have gone for a long, long time. It's more in that the actual imbalance, but then with the policy. If these countries are happy to sell us the sneakers, but then not buy our soybeans, we have a problem. So I'm going to go back to this chart and give you a couple of things about the numbers. And like I said, I've got a whole bunch more points here. Before I do that, I want to tell you about my friends at Redox. If you're listening to the Business of Agriculture podcast, you need to know about them. They've been sponsoring me now for a year and a half. Great folks out of Burley, Idaho, family-owned business, 31 years. Darren Moon founded this company working in specialty crop. He looked around and said, there's got to be a better way. Maybe we can use bio bionutrients instead of harsh chemistry and some of these ridiculous synthetic fertility products, I'll bet you we can create healthier plants using bionutrients. Moved from there into turf, and now turf into increasingly broad acre. You know what? If you're in the Midwest, you really need to check out the bionutrients that can help your crops. One of the big things they push is plant charge balance. Maintaining charge balance allows your plants to focus on the yield and the quality with improved performance come harvest time. You want to learn more about Redox bionutrients and how it can help you grow better crops using less harsh inputs and less expensive inputs? Go to redoxgrows.com. That's redoxgrows.com. Okay, so about this chart right here, 1.2 trillion, you'd say, well, is that a big deal? Maybe not necessarily, because we have such a roaring economy. We are 26% of the globe's economy with only 4% of the globe's population. The entire global economy is between 105 and 110 trillion dollars. We're about 27 trillion dollars right here. To 28 to 29, just depending on which thing you count and which numbers you look at. The point is, we're more than 1/4 of the global economy here in the United States with only 4% of the population. So it would stand to reason. Also, with only about 4% unemployment, it would stand to reason that we are not going to have sneaker factories here, and we're not going to have low-end labor here. We're going to go ahead and offshore that. That makes sense, doesn't it? Sure, absolutely. And that also contributes to the trade imbalance because we're buying a bunch of crap from other countries. Good for them, and generally good for the American consumer. But it's not good when we're not allowed to sell our stuff. And that's where this point about tariffs and then the other obstacles that aren't really necessarily tariffs, where they just flat out ban the imports of any of our stuff. For instance, this is a quote from a person that's with the Institute for International Economics. The French government knows that if it liberalizes its norms on agricultural products, it's going to have tractors lining the streets of Paris. You are in agriculture. One thing that you should know if you're in agriculture is all it takes is the wind blowing the wrong way and the damn French farmers get in their tractors and drive to Paris and start protesting and bitching they're being mistreated. They, dump milk on the Parliament and spread manure outside of the Louvre or outside of the Eiffel Tower. By God, they protest. And one of the things is because they are completely protected. You think the United States of American agricultural sector couldn't basically just run the French farmers out of business? No offense, but we've got vast amounts of natural resources. We have vast amounts of acres. We have acres we're paying people to not farm because we don't need them. We invented the ethanol plan, ethanol renewable fuel standard 21 years ago to burn up our corn. We're burning up 40% of our corn. You think that we couldn't essentially satisfy the 60 million French consumers when it comes to things like corn, soy, wheat, dairy, pork, chicken? Of course we could. The reason we're not allowed to is because France has stringent protectionism and trade restrictions that do not allow American agricultural products to come in there. You see, it's not always tariffs. Sometimes it's outright bans. It means we don't have fair trade. So while I'm not a fan of tariffs, I'm telling you what we could really sure as hell use is a reshuffling of the deck to where they say, all right, why is it that America, which is an agriculturally exportive country, I just made that word up, exportive, agriculturally exporting country, why is it that somehow, since we have this massive economy, we're going to buy your sneakers, we're going to buy your damn TVs that aren't made here, we're going to buy the toasters and the hula hoops that are made in some third world country, that's fine. But by God, you need to buy our agricultural stuff. And that's where some of this trade negotiation could end up being ultimately good for agriculture. Where it could be good, also, I've got another big point on that, and it's about energy. My friend Ryan Moe just brought this up during my Business of Ag Success Group session that we had here on April 11th. We meet every other Friday for about an hour and a half Zoom call. A bunch of agricultural professionals essentially get together and network, and we discuss issues with guest presenters that are impacting the business of agriculture. It's brilliant. For $99 a month, you can become a member. Go to DamianMason.com and become a member. Ryan Moe just pointed out in our Business of Ag Success Group session today, he said one of Trump's, now by the time you're listening to this, it may already be evolved. One of the tenets of his negotiations with the European Union was that Europe needs to bring in $350 billion of American energy. Now, liquefied natural gas is the biggest. It could also be oil. It most likely will not be coal because Europe's been on the climate crusade for longer than the United States. It even predates Al Gore inventing climate crisis here in the United States. Yes, pun intended, joke intended. Look it up. Anyway, it will be liquefied natural gas. It will very likely be some oil, but it could also be sustainable aviation fuel. And that was Ryan's point. What if all of a sudden the $350 billion just contained 5 to 10% of the mix had to be sustainable aviation fuel? Now all of a sudden we are off to the races on making more corn and soy derived ethanol product or our fuel product that can be converted into sustainable aviation fuel. This could be big for agriculture if this happens. And then all of a sudden you don't have the French farmers protesting in Paris saying that you're bringing in corn and soy. You're just bringing it in and it's in something they can actually burn or use for energy. So that could happen. When we look at this chart, where are the problems? Well, we have a $1.2 trillion trade deficit. 1/4 of it, $295 billion, is right there with China. So, again, it's fine because they become the world's manufacturing factory floor, but they also have been very prohibitive about what they allow in from United States companies, and they're also to talk about how this thing shakes out, where it's not just tariffs. What are they doing? This is a headline from just yesterday. They're bringing American companies into little tribunals, kangaroo courts, or unfriendly entities lists, as China and the Communist Party calls them. And they're taking DuPont and basically running them in front of their little kangaroo court and then slapping their hands. Or they're going to tell them that you can't do business here, or they're going to say to do business here, you have to go ahead and turn over all your intellectual property. So American companies are being mistreated. But you know what? They don't have to do business in China. And I think this is where we need to decouple. And I'm going to get to that at the end of this episode. On this list also, Mexico, our neighbor to the south. Been really good for them, globalization, particularly the last 15 to 20 years, really in the last 30. NAFTA came in under Bill Clinton in 1994. That was a North American Free Trade Agreement. Shitloads of manufacturing that already wasn't across the Rio Grande went across the Rio Grande. Automobiles, all sorts of light manufacturing being manufactured there. It comes here. It benefits the Mexican economy, certainly the North Mexican economy, and maybe else as well because we get cheaper goods using cheaper labor. Things like the Ford Maverick pickup truck, I believe exclusively manufactured in Mexico. I can use other examples. That's the one I just read about. Anyway, Mexico, $172 billion trade surplus with us, meaning we buy $172 billion more of their stuff than they buy of ours. Now, you got to be careful here. Because we buy stuff that's made there, it's helped their economy. They are an ascending economy of about 130 million, so a little more than 1/3 the size of the United States, but certainly they're nowhere close to us financially and economically. What we do have with Mexico is a population that's eating better. Number 1 or number 2 export for corn, poultry, and pork. Huge market for that. Mexico has ascended to become our number 1 agricultural customer. So it's my play that what we should do is reset the trade game with China, because obviously they are a communist country. They are a militarily aggressive country. They are a country that's threatening to take over a place like Taiwan. They are obviously militarily almost aggressive toward us. Do you remember the balloon that came over our country? That was a little bit of a shot over the bow. Mexico and the United States and Canada do not have that type of relationship. We also, by the way, run a pretty big trade deficit with Canada of $63 billion. And then the Canadians would say, well, a lot of that's energy from the West and Albertan oil, et cetera, et cetera. I've actually not broken it out. But I can tell you that there is room for improvement here. The European Union is about 1/5. 236 billion of the 1.2 trillion is the European Union. So you can tell me of the 27 countries that make up the European Union that they couldn't figure out a way. They couldn't figure out a way to use a little bit more of America's products? No, they protect especially agriculture and automotive, and they're happy to sell us their stuff. A trade reset, and then also getting rid of protectionist barriers beyond just tariffs would be a very good thing. So I am actually for a renegotiation, while I do believe that tariffs are ultimately not where we should be because it tends to distort economics, as I've already stated. Let's go through a couple of other things here. There's a big thing that says And I'm basically going to change gears here and tell you the criticisms and then my response as an agricultural person from a blue-collar town in Indiana. Before I do that, I want to remind you about our friends at Harvest Returns, new sponsor here at the Business of Agriculture. If you are funding your farm or ranch or agribusiness, it does not have to be hard. Your operation is unique, so why should you try to fit a square peg into a round hole with one-size-fits-all ag credit? You don't have to just go to the bank. I love ag banks. I love small banks. I love a farm credit system. Been a client of mine. But you know what? Maybe you have a unique sort of a situation where it doesn't just fit traditional agricultural lending. That's where Harvest Returns can help you. Harvest Returns is here to help. They understand that every agribusiness is different with a pool of over 18,000 investors. That's right. They have investor money coming in and creative financing options. Harvest Returns can bring the capital you need to reach your goals. You want to learn more about this? Visit www.harvestreturns.com. That's harvestreturns.com to learn more about how you can get started with growing your operation today. Again, not everything fits the traditional ag credit model. Check out harvestreturns.com. Okay. Poor consumers pay the price of tariffs. You'll hear that said. And by the way, depending on which political party is pushing for tariffs, you'll hear it from the other party. I've seen this enough. I've been around for enough years. When Democrats wanted trade barriers, Republicans said, oh, the poor will pay the price. And now it's the other way around. Same thing. Here's what I can tell you from being from a blue-collar town and a former factory worker. That's right. I worked in a ceiling tile factory for 3 years, 3 summers. My wife worked in a bottle cap factory. Poor consumers also pay the price of globalization because the people that are not college material, the people that are not going to be white-collar workers can absolutely show up and work in a value-added industry working in a factory. And those factories get shuttered and manufacturing goes away. The whole thing that we've seen from government. Remember under Obama, there was 47 job training programs, federal jobs, which were nothing more than federal waste programs to hire a bunch of federal employees, say, we're going to train you. You cannot take a ceiling tile inspector and train them into a NASA engineer. I'm sorry. They're real damn good at showing up and looking at a piece of ceiling tile and making sure that it had the right paint coating and making sure that it gets put into the box, but they sure as hell are not going to train themselves into a NASA engineer. They don't have the mental capacity to do so. It's just not going to happen. So when we lose manufacturing, and we then talk about correcting it with tariffs, it's true. You're going to pay more for consumer goods, but we've been paying pretty damn hard for the last 30 years for the loss of industrialization. True story. The other part of this is about the capital crowd. The capital crowd, that's right, big money. BlackRock, Larry Fink, he's already been on business news every day this week, I think. I've seen something about Larry Fink criticizing tariffs. Big capital loves globalization because big capital and the people that control big money are not living in little factory towns. They're not going to be impacted when their son or daughter doesn't have a factory job to go through college because you know what? They're worth tens of millions of dollars, if not more than that. Big capital, the Wall Street entity, and politicians have generally done just great under globalization. Take the manufacturing base away and then start saying things like, we're a service economy. It's okay. It's just the natural ebb and flow of things. Well, no, it's not really. Environmental regulations put factories out of business. OSHA put factories out of business. And also your entire change of policy from a governmental standpoint has made it harder to be a manufacturing economy, not to mention things like currency manipulation, et cetera, et cetera. And some of that stuff's over my head. But I can tell you this. The idea that we're going to not be a manufacturing business country and we're going to be only a services business, that's neat for the capital crowd to say because they make money just moving money. They make money advising money. The problem is, as a Playboy article stated 15 years ago, when one of these capital crowd people said, what's wrong with a country that's financial services is a major part of its economy? Here's what's wrong with it. Nothing gets made. No value is added. And you also have an entire segment of the population that's not in movement of capital that unfortunately can only exploit their own time and their own labor to get a return. And when that is not available or is degraded, it is very hard for them. We're a services economy? Oh, okay, great. I worked in a ceiling tile factory making $10 an hour in 1990. Guess what? The service economy people, 35 years later, are still not making $10 an hour, and their service includes filling up a soft drink at a movie theater and bring it to a customer. What value was added? As a manufacturer, a Celotex ceiling tile factory in Lake Grove, Indiana, at one end of the plant, rocks and coke, not the kind you drink, the kind that's like aerated coal, was dumped at one end out of a truck or a rail. At the other end, beautiful ceiling tile came out. That's value added that manufacturing can do. And the service industry has a hard time adding that level of value and thereby can't pay the kind of wages that manufacturing can. That's another case for tariffs. I'm not pro-tariff, but it's a case also for better trade policy, to have a thriving blue-collar base that works in manufacturing. Protecting the manufacturing base has got another element to it. And this one is one that, again, protectionism, generally bad economics, but also it could have a payoff for the defense of your country. What am I talking about? Well, in history, if you actually love history like I do, you will learn something. We didn't win World War II because we had the smartest generals. No offense to Dwight Eisenhower, who became president. No offense to Douglas MacArthur. But Germany and Japan arguably had better military strategists. We won World War II because after we got involved and got our asses kicked for a couple of years, including starting with Pearl Harbor, we ramped up our production machine. We ramped up our factories. We converted factories that were making washing machines to now making military components. Our productive capacity won the war for us, and it's probably won every other war that we've won since then and before then, because our productive capacity, all we could do is we didn't win a war, we outproduced the competition. Agriculturally, we should think about this. We may not be as good at certain things, but by God, agriculturally, we're pretty amazing and we can outproduce the competition. So there's a military or a national security play, or at least argument to be made, of why we should have some level of trade restriction. I should also point out that while we discuss that about this, if you want a more recent example, ships and chips. Do you remember the distortions to the marketplace? I can tell you, as I've given as an example in all of my speeches, I drive by the Fort Wayne auto assembly, the truck assembly plant for General Motors when I go to the Fort Wayne airport. When I do so in 2020 and 2021, I keep noticing more and more and more Chevy and GMC trucks just piling up out there. Why did they pile up? Because the trucks were manufactured, but it couldn't be sold. Why could they not be sold? Because it was manufactured, and while it was sitting there, it looked like a beautiful truck. It didn't have the chips. Now, I don't know necessarily what a chip sells for, but the point I've made is if you got a $50,000 or $60,000 pickup truck sitting there, completely manufactured, but it cannot be sold without that chip, what's the chip worth? $50,000 or $60,000. Now I point to you why there is an actual non-tariff element, component to having some level of protective trade policy. If you are completely dependent on one country to make the chips for your Chevy Silverado or GMC Sierra, and you can't get the damn thing, then that country has you completely over a barrel, and you'll pay whatever for the chips. Now let's talk about ships. Anybody have a guess? Raise your hand if you know who the biggest shipbuilding country in the world is. Who builds almost all the ships, in fact. Because we decided, hey, we don't need to build ships here. Too many environmental compliance issues. It's messy, it's dirty, it's hard work. Nobody wants to do that. China's the number one shipbuilding country. So when you think about the case to be made for why we should reconsider our trade policy, the trade policy that's been very good, again, for the capital crowd, the Wall Streeters, even the politicians who ingratiate themselves greatly through all the lobbying that said, hey, we should just make this happen. It's not been very good for Main Street. It's not been very good necessarily for a lot of blue-collar people. Has been good for agriculture, arguably. We're making 50% more corn, soy, and pork than we did just 25 years ago. Good for us. Exports have been remarkable. But do you know that we're actually at a trade deficit in agriculture? Yeah, you didn't know that, did you? China never, ever bought nearly as much as they pledged to buy. In the year 2019, 2018, when they pledged they were going to buy $50 billion of American agricultural products, you know the most they ever got to was in the year 2022. They got to about $36 billion of our stuff. They made it to about 78% as much as they said they would. So they did. That's a C, by the way, a C plus if you're being generous of giving grades. China said they'd buy $50 billion worth of American ag products. They never even came close. They got to a 78% of that actual pledged amount. And that was during 2022 when commodity prices were as high as they've been. So the reality is China, making their ships and their chips, should be forced to buy more agricultural stuff from us if we're going to be a customer of theirs, paying for $295 billion more of their crap each year than they're buying from us. Instead of that, they're going to Brazil and setting up Brazil as a satellite country, essentially. A little country that's going to kowtow to China because Brazil doesn't have nearly the economic force. We're 26, 27% of the global economy. China's 18%. Brazil, hanging around 1%. Less than 2%, let's say. So, who holds the cards in that argument? Who holds the cards in that card game? China does, of course. So China should be forced to buy more of our stuff if we're going to be their customer. And as I said, when we think about it, think about ships and chips, which brings me to my final points. First off, there's an argument that there's going to be higher prices to pay. And I want to tell you that this has been an interesting time if you like economics and you pay attention to such things. Generally, when anything gets more expensive, consumption of it goes down, right? Especially when things are like, I have trade-offs. I can make a substitution. In agricultural economics, we talk about the protein trade-down effect. If the price of a steak goes down, you go from steak to burger. And then maybe all beef prices are going up, so you trade from burger down to pork loin or pork chops, and you trade down to even sausage or a lower cut of pork. And then from there you go down to chicken, and from chicken you go down to eggs, and then from there it's to Spam or peanut butter or whatnot. What's happened, of course, the egg thing has gotten crazy because that's a completely non-economic situation. It's the bird flu where we've culled nearly 1/3 of our hens over the last year and a half. So we've got a huge decrease in supply of eggs. But go back to the other thing. Beef prices are as high as they've ever been, nominally and in real dollars almost. Yeah, that means adjusted for inflation. So what we're talking about, beef should be declining in consumption. Because as economic theory holds, and economic truth, not even theory, it's a law of economics. As prices go up, demand, and therefore consumption goes down. Yet we're still holding out. We ate 57 to 58 pounds of beef last year per American. That's what we ate 5 years ago when food was 25 to 50. In beef's case, it wasn't 25% cheaper. It was about 90%, 80% cheaper. Beef's doubled in price in the last several years. And yet consumption's hanging around. So there is some defiance among the American consumer to not follow what they're supposed to do economically, which means when the price goes up, you're supposed to decrease consumption. So thereby, you must wonder if trade policy is indeed going to make some goods more expensive. Does the consumer do what you're supposed to do, which is trade off and decline consumption, or stick with consumption? It's too early to tell any of that because really the prices have not gone up because the tariffs have not been impacted or enacted because of the 90-day pause that was just put on. Now it's still on for China. And this brings me to my last thing about the United States and China. As I told you, we're around 27%, 26% of the global economy. China's around 18%. China very much wants to be our replacement. They would love for us to be a lesser economy than theirs. They would like for our military to be decimated and be less than theirs. They want to be our replacement. You've heard me say this again and again and again. Replacement militarily and economically. That is China's objective. They're holding out and playing very tough. My friend Todd Thurman, who goes to China all the time, says that he has people in China calling him, asking if he's all right, because the propaganda machine in China is telling all of the nation, all 1.3 billion Chinese residents, that China is winning this trade battle and that there are barren shelves in the United States of America because we don't have anything. Now, I'm recording this here in the middle part of April, and I just went to the store, and I can tell you that there's no barren shelves. But that's how Chinese propaganda is working. They do not want to lose anything that looks like face. They do not want to even pretend that they've given in. That's why their propaganda machine is ramping up. I'm telling you that we do need a game reset using whatever means necessary with China, because I believe that they are a threat to American sovereignty. They're also a threat, really, to global stability. Right now, things are a little choppy. I do not approve of how this thing has been rolled out. I've been accused a lot of things by my detractors on social media that I'm a Trumper or I'm this or that. No, I'm telling you about the business of agriculture. And I'm telling you where this trade thing is. I told you about the distortions to the market that tariffs create, but I've also told you that there's a lot of countries that distort the market also using non-tariffs, meaning they don't charge us to bring stuff in. They just flat out don't allow it. Or they make it so restrictive that you can't. Or, for instance, the DuPont model. Yeah, you're allowed to be here and do business with us, but we're going to be very hard on you with the inspections. And we're going to make sure we bring you into our little kangaroo courts and pretend that maybe you're in violation of some sort of a code. Those are trade restrictions that are not actually charges the way tariffs are. But back to the China thing. This is my deep concern for agriculture. I believe we need a game reset. I believe that American agriculture has apparently learned very little. We love making stuff. By God, we want to just make more corn and more soybeans and produce more bushels of wheat and then more pounds of rice and throw more pounds on those steers out there in them feed yards in Kansas. And let's make more milk. And we love growing and producing stuff. The problem is, you've been hearing for 20 years, every meeting you go to, every meeting I've spoken at, some pinhead gets up there and talks about China, 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 China. Well, China's not even our number one ag customer anymore. They're number 3 behind Mexico and Canada, which are now tied as number 1 roughly. And also, that is 2 countries with a population of 130 million, 40 million. And we're talking about they are buying more of our stuff than the country of 1.3 billion. Okay, Mexico is less than 1/10 the size of China and is buying more of our ag stuff. What's that tell you? China, we should have learned our lesson. They had us over a barrel with the whole first time on the trade war that Trump and China got into 7 years ago. 2018-19, Trump decides he's going to reset the trade balance with China, as he calls it. And guess what? All of a sudden, they said, we're not going to buy stuff. Then they pledged to buy stuff. And they never bought anywhere close, as I told you. They bought about 78% of what they pledged. Can you do that in your contracts? Can you contract to do something and then only pay 78% of what you agreed to? You can't, can you? So China's never been held accountable, ever. Damian, you're anti-China. You're damn right I'm anti-China. I'd love to have a complete decoupling with them, period. Work with Europe, work with the North American countries, Canada and Mexico, and then the Asian countries that are around China that obviously are intimidated by them that want to then be sucking up to the United States for our protection, and by God, then we'll deal with them. I'd love a decoupling, complete 100% decoupling from China. No question, period. It'd be better for everybody. I will point this out. They've never lived up to any agreement they've ever made. They had us, they decided to try and cause us harm. They decided not buy soybeans and not buy the stuff that they know hurts America in 2018, 2019 during those trade negotiations. Then we go into the COVID shutdowns, the COVID that China gave us, that gave the world, that caused great economic harm to the globe. And what did China do then? China held back on stuff that we needed. And all of a sudden, we didn't know if we were going to be able to put crops out. Remember, because we had our inert ingredients and our active ingredients to crop inputs made in China. And the plastic that we needed to put in those jugs made in China and the shipping containers. Oh, my God, we didn't have that. So here we are, 2018, 2019, in a trade dispute with China. They never agreed to do what they said they were going to do. And we just decided to go ahead and look the other way. Well, they buy some of our soybeans. It's okay. Well, they don't buy near what they pledged. And we said it's okay. Then 2020, 2021, we allow this whole situation where China has us over a barrel. We can't get shipping containers. We can't get crop inputs. And then we couldn't get chips. So the damn trucks are sitting there. And you needed a new truck for your farm. You couldn't get it. And here we are in 2025. This is the 3rd time in 7 years where now we're saying, oh, crap, we need certain products from China because we still have our infrastructure there. And then what do we go to ag meetings and say? Well, we just need to get this trade thing figured out because we can sell soybeans to China. How stupid are you, agriculture? I'm really asking you this. You want them so badly to buy your soybeans that you're going to allow them to never live up to an actual agreement that they make, and then you're going to say, we need that demand. Yeah, we got to have them. I got to have a country like China buying our stuff. And oh, by the way, all these companies are making the stuff there that we need for inputs, and we never moved it offshore. We never reshored it, should I say. We got stung in 2018, 2019. We got stung again in 2020 and 2021. And here it is 4 years later, 2025, and I'm hearing the same thing. Better get things straightened out with China so they'll continue to buy our corn, and better get things straightened out so we still have our inputs. I'm asking you, when are you going to figure this out, American agriculture? China's not our friend. We should not have our manufacturing there. Our crop input should not come from there. Our pharmaceuticals should not be coming from there. And we should not be this dependent on them for our export market, because trust me, they want to go away. That's why they are setting up the entirety of South America with ports in Ecuador that they've funded, rail and infrastructure projects in the rest of South America, and clearly mostly Brazil, that they can take all the natural resources and agricultural product. So I'm asking you, I'm closing out here on the whole thing about free trade isn't really free and how China factors into this. Are you ever going to learn your lesson? Because apparently this is the third time you're still saying, yeah, but they're going to buy our stuff, and by golly, we can't get by because how are we going to have our chemicals that all come from China? Demand that the companies that are in this industry actually smarten up and move manufacturing to a different location. Probably ultimately Mexico, probably India in the meantime. This can work for us. Damian Mason talking about fair trade, free trade, and the fact that we don't really have free markets or fair trade, the reality of tariffs, and more importantly, the impediments to globalization that are put about by globalization touting countries that actually then secretly use protectionism and bans and restrictions and alleged requirements of codes and legal or environmental claims to restrict the import of American agricultural goods. I still believe that the American agriculture is going to be fine. We're just going to have to learn to be fine without China, as you know who calls it. Damian Mason, thanks so much for being here. Check out my friends Redox, New Fields Ag, and Harvest Returns. Also check out my show, The Granary, filmed with my friends from Extreme Ag. That's right, we sit in my drinking room, my cool little barn in Huntington, Indiana, and we talk about all things impacting agriculture, the personal, the professional, with my farm buddies from Extreme Ag. Till next time, thanks for being here. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Damian Mason. And this is, as ever, The Business of Agriculture. Hey, sincere thanks for joining us here on another episode of The Business of Agriculture. I want to ask you, if you farm, are you looking for more productive efficiencies to grow higher yielding, better performing crops? Well, of course you are. New Fields Ag provides a complete portfolio of biological products focused on you, the farmer. If you want to learn more about the New Fields Ag product lineup, go to newfieldsag.com for information.